the four sources of monopoly. Um, yeah, so today we're going to jump right in with how a monopolist chooses their the price and quantity that they're going to sell for a good. Okay, so like any other firm, they're going to maximize their profit where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Let's see, they're going to choose a quantity produced just like perfect competition and monopolistic competition, which we're going to talk about later. And they face a downward sloping demand curve, unlike the perfect competition where they face the horizontal demand curve. The difference between monopolists and perfect competition is that there's barriers to entry that's going to prevent other firms from jumping in and competing with them. So let's look at an example. Comcast is a monopoly for, for like the cable market for, I don't know, a lot of the East Coast. I was really upset when I moved to Washington, D.C., because we actually had choices down there for cable companies. We had Comcast, then like Verizon Fios, and then a local one. And unfortunately, somehow Comcast had like the best ratings down there for like consumer satisfaction, despite them being, freaking Comcast. And everyone loves their stellar reputation for customer service, which they made fun of in this South Park episode. So right here is like that demand schedule that we looked at in perfect competition. This is for the monopolist Comcast. So the first two columns of the table are going to show the market demand curve, which is also Comcast demand curve because they're the entire market. So you have their subscriptions per month, so the quantity in the first column, then the price in the second column. You see as the price increases, the quantity demanded is going to decrease. And then your total revenue, your average revenue, and your marginal revenue, these are all calculated in like the same way that we did for perfect. Yes?
Sorry for interrupting, but can I sit in my chair?
Oh, yeah.
Right now?
Yeah, hurry up.
Okay. Hi. Okay. Oh my god. No.
You wipe out and get injured. I'm going to get in trouble for this.
Why? I lost my balance.
So your total revenue is going to be the price times the quantity. Your average revenue is going to be the total revenue divided by the quantity. And marginal revenue is going to be the change in total revenue divided by the change in the total quantity. Most cases, your change in total quantity is going to be 1, so it's just whatever the change in total revenue is. So if you move from 6 subscriptions to 7, total revenue is going from 252 to 273. So the difference between the two of those is going to be 21. So that's your marginal revenue in this case. So as Comcast decreases their prices, they're going to increase the revenue they make from selling additional units. But they're also going to make less on the units they would have sold. So because of this, the marginal revenue curve is going to be less than the demand curve. So if you look at the graph right here, the marginal revenue curve, and then up here is the demand. And this makes sense if you think, say they drop their price from $42 per subscription to $39, they're going to sell additional units. So the marginal revenue here is going to be 39. However, you need to subtract the $3 per unit that they're losing on the previous, however many units. I think in this case it's like 5. So you're going to need to subtract the $3 for those 5 units, and you end up with a marginal revenue that's much lower than the 39 you gain from decreasing the price. So in this case, marginal revenue will be like, let's say if it's 5 units times 3, it'll be 24 instead of 39. So your marginal revenue curve is going to be below the demand curve for monopolists. All right, so now this graph includes the marginal cost curve for the monopolist. We assume the marginal cost is the same Nike swoosh shape that the perfect competition had. In this case, the monopolist is going to maximize their profit by producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, where these two curves cross each other. So it's going to be right here at point A. They're going to produce six subscriptions at this quantity, but they're not going to price it at 27 where these two curves cross. They're going to price up here at the demand curve. In this case, it's going to be 42. Yeah, so you're going to, what you want to do when you're like working through where a monopolist is going to maximize their profit, right here, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the quantity, and then you take the quantity up to the demand curve. And that's going to be a profit maximizing price. So obviously this is a much worse case than perfect competition. Imagine this is a perfectly competitive market. Price is going to be down here. So basically what you end up with is a higher price that consumers are being charged per good. Now we're going to calculate profit the same way for monopolists that we did in perfect competition. So the profit is going to be, per unit is going to be the price minus the average total cost. And then you're going to want to multiply that by the quantity that's sold, and that'll give you the total profit. So in this case right here, we have, this time we include the average total cost curve. Your profit is going to be the difference where marginal revenue is marginal cost. That's the quantity. The price will be 42 up here where it hits the demand curve. And you subtract the difference between the price of the demand curve and the average total cost. So in that area is going to be the profit. You multiply that by the quantity, and you get the total profit. Yeah, so it's the same exact way that we did with perfect competition. Do you guys have any questions about how we're doing that? Are we calculating profit? Okay, then I'll jump in and explain the whole thing again. So now in the long run, remember in perfect competition, the other firms that they saw economic profit, like right here, that big profit in the green square, before if firms saw that, they'd jump right in and they would compete because they had a chance to make a profit there as well. They know these firms are in that market, are succeeding, they're doing well, and they want to, I don't know, get a piece of the pie. In a monopoly, there's barriers to entry. Say for Comcast, it's really expensive to build the infrastructure to start supplying cable. So that's going to prevent firms from jumping in and supplying more cable, except in like the biggest, like densely packed cities, places like DC, New York, where they have multiple cable companies competing. So in this case, Comcast is going to be able to keep their economic profit because no one's going to be willing and able to jump in. They're not going to be able to afford to compete against them. Obviously, because they get to keep that profit, firms are going to want to try to be a monopoly. That's something that's going to, not only will they be able to profit and maintain that they're not going to have to compete, not going to have to innovate, not going to have to do anything to maintain those profits. So just this week, Matt Mitchell from the Mercatus Center, who I've done a bunch of work with in the past, he has a new paper out. It's surveying the attitudes of businesses, and not surprisingly, they support the free market in general, except within their industry. And within their industry, because of the potential profits of monopoly, especially firms that are already receiving government help, they are much more supportive of them putting regulations on other companies or doing things to help erect barriers to entry that prevents their competitors from joining in. Well, obviously, firms want to earn these profits in the long run. They want to keep their monopoly status or earn monopoly status because it makes competition that much easier. So now let's do a quick thought experiment. So suppose that a market could be either perfect competition or monopoly. Let's think about which one would be better. Better for consumers and better for the economy as a whole. So let's say smartphones initially is perfectly competitive. We've got a ton of firms selling them. And then one firm buys up all the smartphones in the country. All of a sudden, Apple buys everyone, now they're the monopolist. What do you guys think would happen to the price of smartphones? going from perfect competition to a monopolist. I just think the price of smartphones are going to go up. If there's only one seller, they're going to go down. Go up? Yeah. Yeah, the price is going to increase. What do you think? What's going to happen to the quantity of smartphones that are sold? Yeah, they're going to go down. How about the net benefit to consumers, the consumer surplus? On down. How about the net benefit to producers? Yeah, that's going to increase. And then the net benefit to all of society, so the economic surplus. So that's the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. It's going to go. Yeah, and there's going to be dead weight loss, like we saw when the economy is knocked out of equilibrium. Okay, so here's a graph that shows that. In a perfectly competitive market, they're going to produce where the demand curve crosses the marginal cost curve. So here, the price is going to be right there, P sub C, and the quantity produced is going to be Q right here. Now, everything above this dotted line is consumer surplus, so this triangle, and everything below this dotted line is producer surplus. Now, once Apple becomes the monopolist in this market, they're going to produce where the marginal revenue curve crosses the marginal cost curve. So it's going to be right here. Now, the price they're going to charge up here on the demand curve, so that's the price for monopolists. You see the price is increased. Also see they're producing here. The monopoly quantity is lower than the quantity in perfect competition. So there's going to be fewer units sold, and there's going to be a higher price for each of those units. A right here, which used to be part of consumer surplus, that's now going to be producer surplus. That's going to the monopolist. So that's what they're making, in excess of the cost they're willing to supply the goods at. Then B and C, these two right here are going to be the dead weight loss. How much worse the economy's off because they're not producing as much goods. People aren't able to consume as much as they would in a perfectly competitive market. So, so what we see is that the economy as a whole is worse off because of the existence of a monopoly. If there would be competition, economic surplus would be maximized. B and C, which are dead weight loss for monopolists, would not exist in a perfectly competitive market or monopolistic competition market. So there's a question about how large the efficiency losses are due to monopolies. There are relatively few monopolies in the modern day, so the loss of economic efficiency due to monopolies is relatively small, especially just looking at the US, it's relatively small. Many firms have some sort of market power, so it's the ability to charge a price that's greater than the marginal cost. Usually this is due to monopolistic competition, or in that case, firms do have a monopoly over their own good because there's something about that good that differentiates it from the other goods. So in a perfectly competitive market, like everything was the same. Like you take your wheat, like your wheat's going to be the same no matter what farmer grows it. But if you're looking at some other product, you're looking at, say, like computers or smartphones, there's ways to differentiate them. You can get more memory, more RAM, bigger screens, clearer screens, better cameras on them. Little things you can do to give yourself a little bit of market power. And then you'll be able to charge more than a perfectly competitive price. The only firms that have no market power are those that are competing in perfect competition. And like we said earlier, like this is pretty rare. You don't see a lot of perfect competition going on because they're able to differentiate goods. So economists estimate that overall in the United States, the loss of efficiency due to market power and to monopolists is probably less than 1% of total production. So they estimate about $500 per person annually. That's how much worse off each person is due to monopolists who deal with like Comcast or local electric company, and maybe some large producers, probably the auto industry because there's only a few large firms competing. most firms face a relatively large degree of competition, and even if there isn't a direct competition, so say you only get one cable provider in your region, you still have Netflix, you've got like DVD sales, you can go to the movie theaters, and you can do other stuff for entertainment. If you classify the market more broadly as entertainment, people can substitute out of, buying or watching cable, watching TV. They can do other things that will take the place of the entertainment that cable provides. So even if they don't face an exact competitor, there is still some sort of competition for them to face. So then they conclude that deadweight loss due to market power is relatively small. That it's not a big deal in the United States, at least not currently. So now the chance to gain market power, that could be a good thing, even if market power itself is not. Even if that does reduce efficiency and increase costs for consumers. The opportunity to profit from market power, it drives firms to innovate. So they try to create new products, they try to capture a market to be the only one producing in this market. Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, he coined the term creative destruction, which basically refers to firms competing, creating new technologies, whether it's like new processes to actually like engage in production of these goods, or whether it is new goods themselves. The new goods destroy the old industries and force them out. So think of how the internet and like personal computers got rid of fax machines, and now smartphones are getting rid of personal computers. As one industry takes off and it provides whatever the old industry did, it provides it better and it provides it cheaper. That destroys the old industry. And this is the idea that he talked about quite a bit through competition. And it's going to make people better off. Obviously, we're better off today with automobiles than we are with when people took trains and horse and buggies everywhere. That those old industries didn't provide people as much utility as automobiles do now. So those old industries are destroyed, they're cast by the wayside, and the resources that were used in those industries are now being used to produce like automobiles, things that people need. People want more. So as long as there are no barriers to entry, when firms attempt to gain market power through the creation of a new good and offering a new product to people, to consumers, there's no barriers to entry. Consumers are better off because as soon as that other firm steps in and makes this new good that displaces the old industry, they have a monopoly for a short time because they're the only provider, but other firms can step up, see what they're doing, enter the market, and start offering the good. At that point, they start competing and then dropping prices down to at least close to the marginal cost, if not to the marginal cost, depending on how many competitors are in the industry. So if this firm begins to act like a monopolist, if they do have a monopoly for a while, if they increase their prices with no barriers to entry, another firm can jump in and offer the lower prices, like in a competitive market, because there's nothing preventing them from getting in. The real danger of monopolies isn't when they exist, especially like in the short run. It's when there's a barrier to entry preventing other firms from jumping in, and they can maintain these profits and increase prices in the long run. When that happens, that's what really reduces economic efficiency. All right, so now I'll briefly end with government policy towards monopoly, bitch about antitrust for a little bit, and then we'll jump into the review. So obviously, monopolies reduce consumer surplus and economic efficiency, so governments are going to try to regulate their behavior, try to prevent them from acting as monopolists, or prevent monopolies from occurring. So governments try to stop firms from colluding, and they try to prevent mergers and acquisitions that create giant firms through antitrust laws. The Clayton Act in 1914 had a provision that prevented price fixing between firms. So like Ford, Chrysler, and GM couldn't get together. If they were caught getting together and like saying, okay, we're going to set our compact car price at like here, our like mid-size sedan here, and like so none of them competed on prices, so they could charge higher prices. Government found out about that. That's illegal, and the firms would be punished. They'd get like huge fines, maybe get broken up into smaller firms, which was a way, the penalties prevent collusion to keep competition going in the marketplace. Another type of law is antitrust law, which is aimed at promoting competition between firms. So what that'll do is prevent large firms from joining together to forming a monopoly or gaining too much market power. And it punishes firms for engaging in what's called anti-competitive practices. So like lowering prices below cost to try to force out their competition, tying the purchase of one good to the purchase of another good, things like that. So now the main two antitrust acts that were passed, the first was the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, and then that was followed up by the Clayton Act in 1914. Now these statutes were left intentionally vague. One reason is that economists didn't really know much about monopoly back then. It wasn't something economists studied, so there's really no theory behind it. So the government, with no economists to tell them what monopoly was, left it vague so they could try to determine basically what a monopoly was anytime they saw one or thought they saw one. Another reason is it gave the government more latitude to go after businesses that they thought were engaging in anti-competitive practices. Now there are some political motives that are behind the passage of the antitrust policy. And an example is the Missouri Antitrust Act of 1889. This was passed the previous year. And the impetus behind this law was that there were a bunch of small-time farmers in Missouri. And they were complaining about these larger, more efficient farms that had lower prices for their goods. They began competing in these communities in like the 1880s because transportation costs were significantly lower. So they were able to sell these goods at lower prices, and a lot of the produce or grain or whatever were higher quality than what these local farms were able to produce. So basically the small farmers were trying to restrict competition from these larger farms, which is why how they got the Missouri Antitrust Act passed. But lower prices and increasing quantities of goods are the exact opposite of what neoclassical economics describes as monopoly. Like we talked about earlier, there's higher prices and lower quantities. This is the opposite. This was an example of self-interested people lobbying legislators to try to get legislation to help them out, try to help out their business. In fact, most of the empirical evidence shows that the trust, that was the name for like the giant businesses in the 1880s and 1890s, that they were increasing the quantity and decreasing prices as they were being accused of being monopolists, which again is the opposite behavior that we would expect. At this time, they're just discovering economies of scale. These are rapidly increasing as transportation costs were decreasing between regions. The refrigerated boxcar was invented in like the late 1870s. During the Civil War in the American South, there were 5 different sizes of railroad tracks. So trains could only travel between certain destinations. These were standardized in the 1870s and 1880s. So trains were, could travel on any track and go much farther distances. So it was much cheaper to transport goods in that way. So now the market concentration was increasing, and what they used to measure that is called the Herfindahl Index. If you watch the episode of The Office where Michael goes and teaches at business school, one of the guys asks him what Dunder Mifflin's Herfindahl Index is. It's just a measure of the concentration of in an industry. So it's like the sales of like the top 4 businesses. The higher the number, like the more concentrated it is. So the fact that market concentration was increasing at this time, that Standard Oil is buying up a bunch of firms, that Cornelius Vanderbilt is like owning all the railroads, it was assumed to be a sign of monopoly. And this is the first time in the United States that they'd really seen this, so there was a lot of concern about it. And this is the same attack that like people levy against Walmart today, that they're dropping on their prices, they're charging too low prices, they're trying to be a monopolist. They're also accused of having extra high profits, these trusts back in the 1880s and 1890s. But Harold Demsetz and Oliver Williamson, through their research, they show this wasn't the case, that they had pretty standard levels of profits. The absolute numbers were just really high because they were large firms. Imagine Apple's going to have a much higher profit than like MVP is going to have in absolute terms. Because a lot more people buy Apple smartphones than pizza like an IBP in Cambria County. They also showed that vertical integration, which is kind of surprising, does not increase market power. Vertical integration is when a firm buys either its supplier or they buy who they sell the good to. So like if Ford would buy an aluminum company or a steel company that provides the inputs that make the cars, or if they would buy and own the franchises that actually sell the cars, that's an example of vertical integration. So you're buying another level within the same business. And finally, predatory pricing is not an effective way to create a monopoly. That's usually what's charged, is that a big firm comes in, they sell these goods below cost, they operate at a loss for a while, but it forces all their competitors out of business. Then once they become a monopoly, they're the only one left, they jack up the prices, and people are screwed. Their only choice is like to pay those high prices or not buy the goods. According to Gary Becker, this is often accused of firms, but we have never seen them actually put all their competition out of business and then jack up their prices. And the problem with that is you need to make your competition sure, they need to know that you're engaging in this predatory pricing. Well, if firms suffering losses, it makes sense to short them, short their stock in the short term. You'll make a bunch of money because their revenues are down. And first of all, that's a great way to make cash, but that'll really hurt the company, especially their executives who tend to be paid in a lot of stock options. So they're going to be suffering in the short term, and if enough short sellers jump in, even in the long term, it'll knock their stock price down for a while. And finally, even if you force out competition, all your competitors, your status as a monopolist isn't going to last long. Just because a company goes out of business doesn't mean that its human and physical capital is destroyed. The people that work for that company still know what they're doing. So say St. Francis shuts down, all the professors here know how to be professors, and then all the classrooms still exist. They're not automatically destroyed when students walk out. So an entrepreneur can come in and buy these assets super cheap, and then come in and start competing if they have a better idea of how to produce, or they think of some way to decrease the cost of production. An example of this is the Washington Post in the 1930s. You've all heard of the Washington Post, the newspaper in DC. 1930s, they went bankrupt. They went out of business, and some guy came in. He tried to buy them 4 years earlier, and they wouldn't sell to him. Then he came in and bought them after they went bankrupt for a third or a fourth of the price. Kept all the writers on the staff, kept the buildings and everything, the printing presses, and they're still a giant newspaper today. So it's easy to swoop in and keep these companies going, just buy them on the cheap. And now there's a question of who tended to bring the antitrust lawsuits. For every one antitrust suit that was brought by the government, accusing a firm of anti-competitive practice or acting like a monopolist, there was 20 bought by other firms. And there are two types of firms that tend to bring these antitrust suits. The first is vertical partners. So either the suppliers or the franchisees of these firms, they'll sue over a breach of contract or some dispute they're having with the firm, but they'll bring it, accuse them of monopoly status. They'll say that they were fixing prices, and as a supplier, this was the biggest firm to sell to, so they had too much market power. And they do that because under the Clayton Act, whatever damages that the court deems occurred, the firm has to pay triple as a real strong punishment to prevent them from engaging in these monopolistic practices. But it means that these partners can accuse them of being monopolies to make more money. The other is competitors. According to Thomas Sowell, in his basic economics textbook, in most cases, most of these antitrust cases, is when the monopolists charged too lower prices than their competitors. An example is the old A&P grocery store, which you guys probably never heard of because it barely exists. They were once the largest grocery store chain in the United States, though, and there was a lot of concern that they were the monopolists because there were A&P grocery stores everywhere. However, they only sold about 1/5 of the groceries in the United States, so they didn't have a lot of market power. They were much larger than any other grocery store. And their low prices was evidence of market power, which again doesn't make sense. If you're a monopolist, you're not going to charge low prices, you're going to charge higher prices. And we gave the the Alcoa monopoly, that example from last class, when they had basically all the bauxite they needed to make aluminum. Well, under their monopoly, their output increased and their prices fell again. Yet they were still convicted by the Department of Justice for being a monopolist, which they were technically monopolists, but their prices were lower. They weren't behaving like one. And it makes sense why they were doing this. Aluminum is often an input in goods. It's not the final good. And firms, instead of using aluminum in their production, they could switch to things like steel, to tin, to plastic, use other metals or the materials for either packaging or for the metal used to make the goods. So they still face some competition. If they behaved like a monopolist, these producers that use the aluminum could have just switched to another metal or another material. So even though there wasn't someone competing with aluminum, there were still things competing against aluminum. So there was still some sort of competition in the market. And then finally, the last example is Microsoft. Back in like the 90s, they were accused of having a dominant market share for their operating system. And they got charged for offering, I think, like Internet Explorer and a few other things for free if you bought a PC. Again, they're charged for giving something away, not for charging a high price and restricting output like a monopolist. But this ignored, and like when they defined the market in the Sherman case, they ignored Apple computers, which don't operate with Internet Explorer, and they ignored Linux, which is some alternate sort of internet browser. I guess I don't really know about that. The operating system? Yeah. Okay. So they ignored other competitors and just saying within people that buy Microsoft, like that's all you get. So people couldn't use Netscape, which I don't even know if I remember anyone ever using Netscape. So like they were hurt, but people were better off because like they're getting internet browser for free, and it was pretty good. Well, it was back then. And then finally, when the government did bring the antitrust suits, they didn't do a very effective job of increasing consumer welfare. So they brought suits against firms and industries with relatively low Herfindahl indexes. So there's low concentration in these industries, and where prices were dropping. So these aren't typically, if you're trying to reduce monopoly to increase consumer welfare or economic efficiency, you're not going to go after those industries that they chose. You're going to go after industries with high concentration where there's only a few firms. And these firms were either acting beneficially, like decreasing their prices, or they were just benign, and it was like Microsoft is doing, giving you a free internet browser. And a lot of times when they went after these firms, it was caused by public outcry, people getting really upset at, say, Walmart, or getting upset at Microsoft, whatever firm, was the fun one, the punching bag of the day for people. Those are the ones that the government went after. And obviously, as representatives, that's their job to follow what their constituents want. So it makes sense that they're going to do this, but that's not the best way to try to increase consumer welfare. So while antitrust can be used to increase economic efficiency and consumer surplus, there are some serious problems with how it's been handled in the United States. I think it's clear that there is still some role for antitrust policy to prevent monopolies from forming or to help break up monopolies that already exist. But experience has shown over the past 100 years that it hasn't been done in the best way, and that that there's some serious shortcomings with how it's been implemented so far. And here's a list of the different acts. There's Sherman, Clayton, the Federal Trade Commission Act. Federal Trade Commission Act is another one that gets used a lot. I think that's the one that prevents the tying of two goods together. So an example from some research Timmons and I have done is the Fairness Contact Lens Consumer Act, which was passed through the power granted through the Federal Trade Commission Act. Basically, when you went to get your eyes done or checked an optometrist, they could refuse to give you your contact prescription. So then you had to buy your contact lenses from them, or you had to go somewhere else and get an eye exam from them, which obviously you're not going to pay for that twice. So you're going to eat the higher cost of buying the contacts from them. Basically, what the law said was that that was anti-competitive, that optometrists weren't allowed to do that, that they had to give you your contact lens prescription. And what we found is that decreased the wages earned by optometrists. They were unable to keep that monopoly power once that law was passed. That is a reminder, if you want to go purchase your contacts like online, that sometimes they'll still try to not give it to you, but they have to give you your prescription. They're required by law. And finally, regulating natural monopolies. So natural monopolies can serve customers more cheaply than having multiple firms, like I mentioned with like Comcast, or we talked about electricity utilities before. That laying all the extra wires, creating all the extra infrastructure is going to cost a lot of money. So it's actually cheaper, more efficient to have a monopoly in these like local areas. So what happens is these localities or states have regulatory commissions that their job is to set the prices for these natural monopolies instead of allowing the firms to do it. The thought being that firms are going to set, obviously they're going to set prices higher than a perfectly competitive market. So the regulatory commission tries to set the price, if not at the perfectly competitive level, at least close to the perfectly competitive level, so that people get their, in this case, get their like electricity, get their water, like get it more cheaply. But there's problems with that, like what price should the regulators choose? Should it be a price where the monopoly makes zero profit, zero economic profit, or should they try to maximize consumer welfare and total economic surplus? And then you have a problem with, well, can they actually estimate the demand curves properly? Can they actually estimate consumer welfare? They could probably get to a pretty good approximation of it, but it's going to be very difficult, not possible, to get it like actually estimated perfectly to get the consumer welfare. And that brings us to the end of monopoly. Do you guys have any questions about monopolists, how they act, or policy in response to them? If not, we can jump into the review.
Wait, it's online, right? Or...
The review is online. I just printed one out, so in case I need to draw supply and demand graphs or something. All right, so the exam is going to be chapters 11, 12, and 15. Okay, let me double check that.
Study guide 3.
Yeah, so it's going to be 11, 12, and 15. So it's going to be the cost curves that we did in chapter 11, then perfect competition in chapter 12, and monopoly in chapter 15. Going to be 25 multiple choice questions, 5 short answers, and a couple extra credit questions. Okay, do you guys have any questions about what's going to be on the exam? Or if any of you guys looked at the study guide ahead of time, do you have any questions? If not, we can just jump right in with the review. All right. So what is the economic definition of technology? And what are some examples of technology? Remember, technology, when we're given the economic definition, is different than technology in the common definition. So in economics, it's the process by which firms turn inputs into outputs, so like into goods and services. So it could be new machines that are being used in the production process. It could be new management techniques. It can be even like a new layout of a factory or a new layout of an office. Any of those things can be an example of technology.
Wait, what's an example?
So an example is machines that are used in the production process. It can be new management techniques.
Management techniques?
Yeah, and new processes or new like layouts of the factory, or I don't know, of people's vehicles.
Thanks.
Basically, any example of something that helps a firm produce more efficiently.
Anything that helps what?
The firm produce more efficiently.
That's an example.
No, that's like telling you could basically be any example. An example can be
Anything
anything
that helps the firm.
produce more efficiently.
Okay.
All right. So now define the short run and the long run. In the short run, at least one input is fixed. So it could be like your facilities. It could be I don't know. It could be your capital, like the machines you're using. In our example, we talked about like the pizza place. So like pizza ovens, like things that that you can't change immediately. Now, in the long run, all your inputs can be changed. So they're all considered variable.
In the long run, all what?
All your inputs are variable.
Example.
Variable inputs?
Yeah.
Labor? Labor is variable in both the short run and the long run.
Huh?
In both the short run and the long run, labor is variable.
What's an example of just the long run?
Just the long run would be your facilities.
Didn't you say that was short run?
It's fixed in the short run, but it's variable in the long run. Everything's variable in the long run. Okay, so what are fixed costs and variable costs? So fixed costs are going to be the same no matter how many units you produce. And variable costs are going to change based off of how many units you produce.
And what was the next one? Variable cost?
They're going to change based off of how many units you produce. So for instance, like the cost of wages you're going to pay workers, that's going to change based off of like how many units you produce or how long you have them working. You have them working overtime, you hire new workers to produce more, it's going to increase your cost. If you're producing less and you send them home after working 30 hours in a week, costs are going to go down. Whereas fixed costs are like your plants or the cost of insurance that you're paying, that's not going to change if you produce more or less, that's always there. Next, what are explicit and implicit costs? Explicit costs are the costs that involve spending money. So that's literally the cost you're going to see on like a balance sheet or an income statement. Like that's the wages you're paying, the rent you're paying for for your facilities, that kind of stuff. Implicit costs are non-monetary; they're your opportunity cost. So it's like the alternative ways you can earn money. So it could be working for another company, or it could be like you could have invested money instead of using it to start your company.
Implicit is what?
Opportunity costs.
Wait, what's an example of that?
So it's like I have $10,000 in the bank that I pull out to start my company. I could be making interest off that money. What's that? Implicit are the opportunity costs. So it's not money you're actually paying out, but it's money you could be making doing something else. Okay, so define the marginal product of labor. Marginal product of labor is the additional output from hiring an additional worker. And if you draw a graph of marginal product of labor, okay, so that's it. This shows diminishing marginal returns. So at first it's increasing at a rapid rate, like up here, and then eventually at some point it stops increasing faster and it starts increasing slower. So so up here, like this bottom part is increasing really quickly, then it slows down. That's your diminishing marginal returns, and then eventually you peak, and by adding more workers, you're producing even less. So that graph is just to highlight the diminishing marginal returns. And the reason for that is obviously if you have a ton of people standing around, you hire too many workers, you got a bunch of people standing around, they end up like talking with each other, getting each other's way. Eventually you're going to be producing even less instead of producing more. Marginal product of labor is the additional output from hiring an additional worker. All right, so now the official definition for the law of diminishing returns. So at a certain point, adding more of a variable input to the same amount of fixed inputs will cause the marginal product of the variable input to decline. So think about it in terms of labor. If you keep adding more workers, eventually, more workers to the same amount of capital, you're going to see their output or their marginal product decline.
So more workers to same output is a marginal decline. Right?
Will cause the marginal product to decline eventually.
Wait, say for how can firms overcome this?
So how firms can overcome this is in the long run by adding more capital or by adding any more of their fixed inputs. So adding more capital, more machines, and getting a larger plant or facility. So what's the relationship between the marginal product of labor and the marginal cost? They have an inverse relationship. So when the marginal product of labor increases, the marginal cost decreases.
Wait, when the marginal product of labor increases, the marginal cost decreases?
Yes. So if you can think of it, if you can produce more per worker, if that's increasing, the marginal cost is decreasing. That what you have to pay to get more goods is lower because that one worker that you're hiring is producing even more. So one worker is producing 20, the next is producing 25. Their marginal product of labor goes from 20 to 25. The marginal cost is decreasing because you divide that per unit, so the cost per unit. Instead of dividing by 20, you're dividing by 25. So it's going to be lower. And you want marginal costs low. So draw a graph that includes average total cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost, and marginal cost. It sounds like a lot, but 3 of them are very simple. So your average total cost, should have drawn that last. You get your like U-shaped curve. Average fixed cost starts high and then goes low as you add more units. Because it's fixed, it's one number. It's say 1,000 divided by the number of units. As you add more units, that number's gonna get smaller and smaller and smaller. Average variable cost is going to be, yeah, that's why should have done average total cost last. Average variable cost plus average fixed cost is gonna equal average total cost. That's the sum of those two. So it's going to be, I don't know, the same base, kind of like the basic shape. So average total cost. If you add up average variable cost and average fixed cost, it's going to equal average total cost. So this, and then remember the marginal cost is going to be like the Nike swoosh. Beautiful, isn't it? This is it in a little bit more of a clear form. So your average fixed cost here starts out high and it decreases as you add more units. Average variable cost here starts out high, drops to the point to produce that, and then increases. And the average total cost is the sum of variable and fixed. Your marginal cost is your switch there. I'm not going to have you guys, I don't think I'm going to have you guys draw that. Maybe I shouldn't say that.
It's okay, we can draw it.
That's important to know how those different curves relate to each other. Next is define economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. And why do economies of scale and diseconomies of scale exist? So economies of scale is when a firm grows larger, they're able to decrease their overall costs. So as you increase output, your long run average cost, it falls. Now, diseconomy of scale is the opposite. It's when a firm grows larger that their long-run average cost increases. So once a firm reaches a certain size, it becomes too expensive to try to manage it. The facilities become too large to keep up, or they become too costly, and it becomes more expensive for them to produce more.
Wait. Economies of scale when a firm is large and able to decrease their overall cost.
Yeah, it's when size is beneficial.
Diseconomies
Diseconomy is the
when
opposite.
a firm is large and their overall cost increases.
Yeah. Yeah, so diseconomies of scale can occur because a firm is too large to manage effectively, uses too many resources that are better used elsewhere. Their plants become too large to take care of, things like that. Whereas economies of scale, they exist because firms are able, individuals in the firm, there's workers are able to specialize on like one or two tasks, so they get really good at those and really quick at them. They're able to buy in bulk from producers. So say they're using steel to produce something, they buy a ton of steel, or not literally a ton, like large amounts of steel. It's cheaper than getting like small shipments more often because of transportation costs. There's administrative savings from spreading management costs across their entire business. For these reasons, economies of scale exist. So if you look at your quantity and your average cost, your economies of scale is going to be when the curve is decreasing. Oops.
You need to know that.
You don't need to draw it, but it's just a visualization to help you guys out. And then your diseconomies of scale is going to be where it increases there. So as a firm moves from here to here on the curve, they're producing more, but their average cost is increasing. So now, what are the assumptions of perfect competition? You guys remember that? There's three. There's many buyers and sellers, so a lot of small businesses and a lot of consumers. The products are identical, so there's literally no difference between them. And finally, there's no barriers to entry for new competitors. If any of those three don't hold, then it's not perfect competition. All right, this one's a question for you guys. Give me an example of a market with perfect competition.
Sneaker business.
Is there any, let's see, are there many buyers and sellers?
Yep.
Are there barriers to entry for new competitors?
No.
And are the products identical, or is there a way to differentiate them?
You can differentiate them, but they're the same.
In a way, they're the same. But I think you can argue that there's differentiation between Nike sneakers and New Balances.
Pretzels.
The market for pretzels?
Yeah, they're all the same.
Yeah, that could, if you narrowed, instead of snack food, just down to the market for pretzels.
So they go hand in hand.
You have hard pretzels there?
Do they have hard pretzels there?
Pretty sure.
I didn't know that. The most common example we give is agriculture. Just pick one, pick wheat or pick apples. You don't really get to differentiate. Well, apples is a bad choice because there's different
Apples, different
flavors.
colors.
Yeah,
Mm.
Granny Smith's versus Gala apples. All right, apples is a bad choice. So pick something like bananas where there's no flavors.
We don't finish this, are you gonna put the answer online?
Yeah, I guess I'll have to. I'll just do a quick video. Okay, is the market for restaurants an example of perfect competition?
No.
No, because there's many buyers and sellers, there's no barriers to entry, but the products are not identical. MVP is different from an Ethiopian restaurant, which is different from an all-you-can-eat buffet. All right, define price taker and price maker. In a perfectly competitive market, which is a firm? So a price taker, they have to accept the market price. They can't charge any more for a good because no one will buy it. They'll just buy it from one of their competitors. And it's not worth it for them to charge any less because they'll just lose money when they don't have to. Price maker is a firm that has some sort of market power, so they can set the price above marginal cost. So that's like your monopolist. And in perfect competition, they're price takers.
Price taker.
Price taker. What is the difference between economic profit and accounting profit? Accounting profit is just revenues minus the cost. Literally what you'll see on a balance sheet. Whereas the economic profit considers the opportunity cost or the implicit costs as well. And when firms are competing, they should take into account the economic profit. They should consider, different industries, different lines of business. or different products that they don't sell that they could sell that would earn them a higher profit. Opportunity cost doesn't just exist for individuals, it exists for firms as well. All right, define sunk costs to give an example. Should firms take sunk costs into account when making decisions on whether to produce in the short run? The sunk costs are costs that have already been paid or that you're already required to pay. So say like you sign a lease, you're required to pay that rent. If you're trying to decide on whether or not to produce in the short run, you should not consider sunk costs. That's something that's already been paid. No matter what you do, like it's not going to affect that. So that's not something you should consider in the short run. All right, so in perfect competition, when will a firm shut down production, or when should they shut down production? They should shut down if the price is less than the average variable cost. That's ignoring. Average total cost includes fixed costs, which you don't include when considering whether or not to produce in the short run because it's a sunk cost. Fixed costs are already going to be there no matter what you do. All right. In the long run, in a perfectly competitive market, can a firm earn economic profits that persist? In perfect competition, no. If they earn an economic profit in the short run, other firms will jump in to compete against them because there's profit to be made. That'll compete the profit all the way down, and the price will end up equaling marginal cost. Now, define monopoly and give an example. Monopoly is when there is one producer of a good or service in their market. Give an example. Yeah. So an example is like your cable company, like locally. Within that market, they'll have a monopoly.
Or electric company.
Or the electric company.
I'd say internet providers too.
In most places, internet service providers.
It's either Verizon
It
or
depends where you
Comcast.
are though.
Yeah, some places you have choice. Like
In New
DC,
York
you have
City,
choices.
You have like a million choices.
Yeah. Where there's a ton of people, you can actually afford to compete. But outside of 10, 15 cities in America, you're going to have a monopoly. You might be able to finish this. Maybe not. Okay. So what are the 4 barriers of entry that gives firms monopoly power? The first way is government action through like patents and copyrights. The next way is public franchises, like your electric company, your water company. The local government designates one supplier and then regulates them. The third is control of a key resource. Wait. Yeah, control of a key resource. And then finally, there's the natural monopoly, where the economies of scale are so great that you can only support one group.
What was the second one?
Second one was, oh, excuse me, hold on, I got this wrong. So first is government action. That's split up into patents and copyrights and public franchises. So it's government action, control of a key resource. That one's number 2.
How? What's number 2?
I got messed up because there's 2 under number 1. So it's government action, control of a key resource.
Control a key resource.
That's Alcoa, like controlling all the aluminum.
Okay.
Network effects, and natural monopoly.
You say national or natural?
Natural.
Natural monopoly?
Yeah. they have such great economies of scale that that they put all the competitors out of business because it's so cheap for them to operate. And network effects is the usefulness of a product increases when more people use it. So like Facebook is better when like everyone's on it versus when like 4 people were on it when it first started. The more people use it, the better it gets.
And what's the third, sorry?
That is the third, the network effects. Fourth is natural monopoly. Second is control of a key resource. All right. So now draw a graph to illustrate a firm in perfectly competitive equilibrium. It's your demand, marginal revenue, price. Okay, so you're going to produce at the quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and in equilibrium, the average total cost is going to be equal to the price. So there's 0 profit. The difference between price minus average total cost equals 0. All right. With that, we've reached the end of class. There's 2 more questions left.
4 more. Well,
Did I not grab the last page off the printer?
Yeah, there's still a 4 and 5 after.
Oh. Okay, so there's 4 more. So I can,
Could you put that graph back up?
yeah. So I will, I'll post answers to that, either like a video or me, like just written out in a Word document, whatever's easier. If you guys have any questions, you can come see me this afternoon and tomorrow.